Welcome, everyone. My name is Marcy Ravelli. I am a speech language pathologist and chair of the Northwest Augmentative Communication Society's Learning Networks continuing education program. Um, I am delighted that you are all here for our fall series on thoughtful inquiry, spelling for communication. I'd like to introduce my co-hosts. Um, we have, and sorry, I have to go grab my notes. Presenting with me is Joe Risto. Joe Risto is also a speech language pathologist based out of Seattle, as am I, and owner of Chat Northwest. She has 10 years of experience in the field of augmentative and alternative communication and has worked and consulted across multiple settings, outpatient therapies, autism centers, and so forth, with a big passion for AAC. Um, we also have with us Cass Griffin Bennett. She is an autistic and ADHD self-advocate, and she is a parent of multiple autistic children, including a young multimodal communicator. Cass started her youngest child on a robust high-tech AAC at age 2, and Cass is our NWACS outreach coordinator. And then we also have um, uh, Artie Sagar, who is helping us monitor the chat. So she's kind of our backup admin support for tonight, but you will see her pointed out in part 2. Artie is a mother and primary caregiver of her son, Sam. And I love that you said this, Artie. Her purpose in life is to help Sam find his purpose. But that you also have worked in various technology companies like Microsoft, Dell, and Amazon, and have been enjoying a sabbatical. And then I will introduce our other 2 guests shortly. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. We typically, historically, have offered continuing education certificates for those folks who like to keep track of their continuing ed. In order to do that, I will add a link at the end of the evening into our chat. And if you click on that link and fill out a survey, we will then send you a continuing education certificate. Let's see. Oh, another piece of housekeeping. Artie will be monitoring the chat for us. We have a lot to get through, but we hope to have discussion and the opportunity for questions at the end. So if we don't get to your questions, please feel free, or please know that we will try to wrap those questions into part 2 and part 3. And with that, next slide. Thank you. A statement of views. NWACS embraces the statement that all individuals have a right to communicate. NWACS embraces the statement that all individuals have a right to access literacy. The views expressed in this series do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of NWACS. No endorsement by NWACS is implied regarding any device, manufacturer, resource, or strategy mentioned. Next slide. This is a clarification for our terminology. When we say spelling for communication or spelling as communication, we are referring to the use of generative literacy skills as a primary form of augmentative and alternative communication. So this may have different forms or modalities: typing, writing, keyboarding, partner-assisted scanning, use of alternative pencils, eye gaze frames, print flip charts, and so forth. This may or may not be paired with the use of other communication modalities such as symbol-based communication or verbal speech. We are not in this series referring to a specific method, intervention, or program. Next slide. So our agenda, hopefully tonight we will cover why are we here. We will have our guests, Stone and David, and share their experiences learning to use spelling for communication. We will present some evidence, first reviewing for those of you who are here, what is evidence-based practice? We'd like to look at the current motor evidence for folks who are autistic. And then we will do a brief overview of the history of spelling for communication. Then some time for discussion and sharing. And then hopefully that will lead us into next month in November and then into December because this is a deep topic. So stick with us, please. Next slide. Our learning objectives. Participants will be able to describe evidence-based practice and how this might apply to clinical practice for using spelling as a form of communication. Participants will be able to describe external evidence that demonstrates motor challenges as a characteristic of autism. Go ahead. So, Cass, I think you were going to take this slide. Go for it.
Yes, that's me. Hi, everyone. So most of the talk tonight is going to be SLP to SLP, right? This part isn't. This part is about the reality that for a really long time, autistic non-speakers have been tremendously underserved by traditional mainstream interventions, right? I'm an autistic mom of multiple autistic kids. And Marcy mentioned that my youngest started robust high-tech AAC at age 2. Anyone who's seen me present about AAC knows that I always start talking about Jordan Zimmerman because it was her documentary, This Is Not About Me, that led us to start that AAC journey. Seeing how misunderstood Jordan was until she had access to robust communication was deeply impactful in a way that really cannot be overstated as far as impact on our life. For families like mine who live these AAC Learning Network topics firsthand, one thing we learned pretty early on is the hard truth that providers may be able to help with some things, but the more complex the body, the more complicated the learning profile, the less true help we can usually expect from professionals. We learn that we have to look to each other, to autistic adults, to other non-speakers, to other families like our own, to our own intuition to support our loved ones and ourselves. We know that for autistic people who live and learn in complex bodies with mysterious learning and communication profiles, that traditional evidence has some pretty real limitations and caveats because rarely is it ever taking into account living at the intersection of multiple co-occurring disabling conditions, right? And multiple ongoing interdisciplinary interventions all occurring at the same time, right? So we have to look to each other, to the experience of other non-speaking autistics and their families. The people you see on this slide have had and continue to have really diverse communication and literacy journeys. Some are independent typers like Jordan, some are not. Some always have access to their preferred method of communication, some do not. Parents talk to each other. We see with our own eyes that individuals are gaining access to communication. Maybe they are early on in a journey towards open independent typing and open communication, but they are making progress for the first time in maybe a decade, right? And we talk. We ask our SLPs, our IEP teams, and we're often met with sort of big eyes about this, right? And silence. We're shut down or we're sent a link to the ASHA website, right? Which we've already read, I promise. We know. And because of that reaction, these conversations, they're still happening. They're just not happening with SLPs present, right? And this means that the professional input that SLPs could be adding to the conversation, particularly around literacy, is also absent. And we don't think that's in anyone's best interest. And to that end, we wanted to try to open up the conversation. And that is why we are here. Next slide. We are here because these conversations are already happening with or without speech therapists. Not talking about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Talking about this can be hard, but that doesn't mean doing so isn't valuable or necessary. For parents and families who have seen firsthand, it is undeniable that individuals who primarily spell as a form of communication exist, and that some become independent typers. How did they learn to do that? From motor, AAC, and literacy standpoints. What can we learn from their path that will help speech therapists serve clients and families better? We are also here because we are committed to listening to people who should be in this conversation but are currently excluded. Nothing about us without us. Next slide. We acknowledge that this is a huge topic. We cannot cover it all, even in a 3-part series, which we hope you'll join us for all 3 parts, right? But even that. And this is a fraught topic. We will not come to crystal clear conclusions. And in fact, that is not the point. The point is the conversation, right? We invite you to have this messy, earnest conversation with us. This conversation, I do want to say up front, particularly for AAC users, that this conversation may be triggering, right? Because there may be discussion about authorship and validity of aided communication. We acknowledge that the paths to independent and open communication vary, and we are really grateful to our guests tonight and during the rest of the series for sharing with us from wherever they are along that journey. Thank you very much. Next slide. Joe.
Sorry, just finding my mouse. So thank you so much, Cass, for setting that up and for showing us how families are already engaged in this conversation. And I'm excited to be here to talk about how hopefully SLPs can be engaged in this conversation as well in a way that we feel comfortable with and that supports our clients in their journey towards independent communication. So as SLPs, generally, we know that while we all may have different perspectives, there are some agreed upon facts, especially in the world of AAC, about communication. So SLPs agree that the goal for all communicators is spontaneous, novel utterance generation in accordance with the Communication Bill of Rights, which you can see over here. This doesn't mean just linguistic freedom and ability to communicate. It also means that clients should have a choice in the modality of their communication. We know that there are no prerequisites at all for being taught to communicate. And there are no prerequisites for learning and access to education. And we also know that literacy is one of the ultimate goals of communication for any person who will use AAC as a part of their communication strategies, because it's the only true way not to gatekeep vocabulary, and communication or literacy like communication is a right that our clients deserve to have supported.
Joe,
So what we know,
Joe,
yeah,
interrupt you
go
for
ahead.
a second. It's
Yeah,
Marcy.
please.
We
Yeah.
have some comments that some folks can't see the slide deck, and I'm wondering if we could just take a few seconds to maybe clarify.
Absolutely.
I know some of us are spotlighted, so maybe try to share again.
Yeah,
We have
let me
some
see
people
if I
who
can do
can see. Great. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, let's go ahead and share again. And definitely put something in the chat if you are having difficulty still. Thank you, everyone. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Marcy. So kind of reviewed what we know as SLPs, and here's what we're curious about. So SLPs, we can talk, and we talk a lot about literacy for communicators who use AAC. And when we talk about this, when we say spelling, it primarily means reading and writing. And we can't talk about spelling as a way of communicating. I think in some ways that was shown by the response to this talk itself. Once spelling was in the title, there were a lot of questions and beliefs about what this talk would be about, and people coming to it with preconceived notions. So spelling has kind of become a taboo and a highly charged word, even though we can talk about it in the context of literacy. And why can't we talk about it? This came from a conversation with Cass early on, but it feels like it's because mom says no, right? There's a mandate from ASHA that that some of these strategies that are focusing on spelling as communication are not valid, and therefore we can't use them. So it's become taboo, and it is. I'm nervous to talk about it myself because it does feel um, like a risk to even acknowledge that this is a part of what we encounter as SLPs, especially those of us who are specialized in AAC. But it comes up, it really does. So how can we have an earnest conversation about this? How can we really talk about what is going on and integrate literacy into this conversation? What can we learn from the evidence-based practice diamond, EBP diamond, which we'll be going into here in a little bit? What are some takeaways that we can use to guide literacy and language interventions for AAC users who may or may not wind up using spelling as a primary communication method? And we do have some emerging evidence that autistic learners do have more literacy abilities than we are able to measure. What does this mean for our ongoing intervention for our AAC users? And Marcy, I'll flip it to you for the rules of engagement.
Thanks, Joe. Um, so rules of engagement for our discussion tonight. Any period of time without an effective form of communication is traumatic. And that was a quote from, is a quote from Jordan Zimmerman. And so we will take steps to minimize trauma for our AAC guests, up to and including removing participants who are engaging in behaviors that constitute harassment. We define harassment as behaviors that reinforce systems of oppression related to disability, sex, gender, race, sexuality, or any other identity. We are not open to critique or criticism of identities, people, and lived experiences, especially our AAC users in this series. This includes the modality and content of their messages. We are here to talk about theories and ideas, but we're also here to talk about people. And those people are our guests today and should be treated respectfully as such. We do invite open discussion and curiosity around the topics and ideas regarding spelling as communication. And when we disagree, we do so with empathy and thoughtfulness in a way that's respectful. Next slide. Ah, great. Perfect. Good timing. Okay. With that, I would love to, just checking all my things here, checking here. Perfect. With that, I would love to invite Stone and David to be pinned or spotlighted, if you will, and I will tell you a little bit about Stone and David. Here we go. Stone is 18 years old, a non-speaking autistic individual who, after years of not being able to communicate reliably, found his voice through a spelling methodology at the age of 16. This breakthrough transformed his life, empowering him to share his unique perspective on the world. Stone's journey is a powerful testament to resilience, determination, and the belief that everyone has a voice worth hearing. He now speaks to inspire others, offering hope and encouragement to those facing similar challenges. And David Kofter is Stone's dad. As a passionate advocate for inclusion and presuming competence, David has become a voice for other parents navigating similar challenges. His experience as a father coupled with his professional background in marketing and storytelling, equips him to share insights on how families, educators, and healthcare providers can create more inclusive environments. So with that, welcome David and Stone. Stone and David, welcome.
Thank you very much. We'll be probably keeping this muted more than not, but because this will be Stone's show. But I just want to thank everyone, Marcy, Cass, Joe, Artie, for organizing this, bringing this discussion together, and this audience, and everyone out there who's joining us. Thank you for being open to learning about this topic. We understand it's a paradigm change, and anytime you're facing a radical paradigm change, which I faced myself against Stone, as you heard, started this journey 2 years ago. And, it was something that at the time, never thought I could have seen this journey happen. Okay. But we're in it, and we're really excited to talk about it. And, as you can see, Stone's really jacked too.
I'm so happy to have you. So let me explain to our attendees tonight that Stone and David were given the questions in advance so that they had enough time to think through and compose the answers. However, the first one, Stone, we already know that you're 18. Is there anything else you want to say about who you are or what you do? David, do you want to read that?
Yeah, so in the chat window. So yeah, Stone said, yes, I'm excited to be here. And
Great.
and just so everyone knows, Stone has progressed through the spelling typing methodology to the point where he primarily uses a keyboard, and actually recently has started using the iPad as well, an app on that for a lot of his communication. And he's also working his way to independent typing. He's working having the keyboard on a stand, and that's a goal. I know he'll be there. So Stone, I'll let you add to that. So Stone said, yes, I will be typing independently. He's an extremely determined, resilient young man. I say that both as his father, but also as a communication partner, and someone who's seen him overcome so much. So, and I don't bet against him at all. He's already, like I said, exceeded expectations.
I love that. And so, the questions that I sent you, we're really trying to get at what has your journey been like? What can we learn from your journey? But the second question specifically, just to give us a little more context, is to Stone, how did you communicate when you were younger? And David, do you want to read his answer?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Like, as you mentioned, Marcy, again, thank you. So Stone, I had these, I presented these to Stone, and he answered all these. He wrote out the answer. And so for that one, as far as how he communicated when he was younger, he said, I mostly wasn't able to communicate before I began spelling. I could say a few words and phrases, but they weren't always reliable. I had Prolo on my iPad. I wasn't able to use it to communicate. I like playing around with it though. And that's true. We bought Prolo, God knows, whenever it first came out, back when he was little, and he liked playing with it, but unfortunately wasn't able to communicate utilizing it.
I imagine if we could have all 60 people tonight with a show of hands, we'd all say, "Yep, we've seen that."
Yeah.
Playing around with Proloquo. Yeah, big truth. So the next question then is, what helps you to learn to communicate by spelling? What is it that influences your ability to communicate by spelling?
Yeah, so Stone's answer is, I'm treated like a regular student at Brightmont, he's a student now at Brightmont Academy, where he gets one-on-one instruction. He's now taking high school level curriculum, which he was not receiving at his public school, and he loves it. So he said, I'm treated like a regular student at Brightmont with my spelling. When people see me spell, they know I'm smart. I appreciate it when people presume competence like my teachers do at Brightmont. The classes are one-on-one, and this helps me work at my own pace. And now I can ask and answer questions. I enjoy the quizzes and tests.
So Stone, you really enjoy the quizzes and tests? Really? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, do you really enjoy the quizzes and tests? He's really excited. He said, yes, I love them.
Right on, man. That's so great.
And he does. It really is. It's so fun to see. And he just, it's great because the curriculum they use is real time. So you get real time scoring. So you get to see when it's 80, 90, 100%. And it's really powerful.
Stone, will you have a conversation with my son so that he can learn to love tests and quizzes? That would be really helpful.
We wish the same with his twin brother.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question I had was actually directed towards you, David, as his parent. Do you agree with what you see as being helpful for Stone? What helps in supporting Stone?
I know.
And also, when is it difficult for you to support him?
Yeah, that's why I said, presuming competence is really everything. Really since we kind of discovered this and he started spelling on a consistent basis and answering open questions. I said, honestly, there have been few difficulties. I mean, it's really just been putting in the work and just doing it. So it's really the challenge has been providing the opportunity, finding the time to do it. In kind of the typical day. I would say the biggest challenge, if you call it that, and again, this is just, to me, it's understandable. It's just, and this has actually changed even since Marcy. It's just having him initiate more. Again, I think it's just, he's so used to not having that opportunity to initiate communication, conversation. But now that's starting, and he's starting to initiate it on his own, where he'll be able to let me know that he wants to say something or he has something to say or share.
Great.
That's so appreciated. I heard you say kind of two really good takeaways, which is the time, right? Finding the time.
It takes time. Yeah. Yeah, because especially, and again, the analogy I heard early on, when describing it to me, because again, it's really kind of hard as a parent. It was hard for me to wrap my brain around how it worked, kind of hearing descriptions, and this is before seeing it. But talking about motor skills was just saying it's similar to learning how to play golf or anything like that, right? And so, not many people can drive a ball 200 yards the first time they swing a golf club, and I think it's very similar with spelling, though, again, obviously, again, skill levels vary, and in Stone's case, he took to it very quickly and progressed very quickly as well.
Maps.
Um,
So
so the next question that I had is, when is communication
I
difficult,
it.
and
I
what gets
know.
in the way?
I saw it.
Yeah, it really, I was thinking about that, and this is where, again, I kind of said before, it's just, for me, there aren't really any challenges other than just making sure that we have the modality available.
Actually,
So, like now we have
Okay.
letterboards around the house, and
Okay.
now it's easier, obviously, with the iPad. He usually has the iPad
I saw
with
it.
him. The other thing, frankly, again, is because I'm his
I saw it.
CRP, his communication regulation partner.
Yeah.
I'm his primary partner for that in the house. So there, he's still
Right.
working through me, although, again, like he said, he's working towards independence. He has a practitioner who he also works with.
Nice. Okay, great. Yeah. Does Stone, you had an answer that you haven't shared yet.
Go.
I don't know if David, you want to just read it, or Stone, if you want to just say, like,
We're gonna
what gets in the way for you? When is it hard for you, Stone, to communicate?
Yeah, so Stone said, I think it's hardest when I'm dysregulated, which makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Stone.
A bit.
Last question we have is there anything else you want to share with parents, teachers, and therapists watching? And this was a question directed to Stone. David, did you want to read that answer?
Sorry, I was trying to look. I don't see that on my responses. Do you have that?
I do have it.
Okay, yeah. So I must be looking at a different version.
Yeah, no worries.
So I'll give you the honor of reading that one.
I love it. Stone, is that okay? Can I read your answer?
Happy.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay.
I see.
So the question again was, is there anything you want to share with parents, teachers, therapists watching? And Stone said, yes, I want everyone to know that I appreciate you wanting to learn about spelling. I know it's controversial to some speech therapists, but I can tell you it's changed my life more than I ever imagined it could. So we really appreciate that comment, Stone. So we're going to move on in our presentation because we have so much to cover. For those who are interested in asking Stone any questions that they have for Stone, they will be available. They will be monitoring the chat. They will kind of look through the questions and try to get to a few if they can. And if they can't get to all of them, we might have some time at the end to share the answers. And then also, we can invite them back. We will invite them back in November and December. So if you don't get your question answered, we will try to get to it at a different time.
Thanks again, Stone and David, for your insights. We really appreciate it, and appreciate you being here and being a part of this panel. I know there's, like you said, it's all about the time. So
Yeah,
we
we could
appreciate
go
that you
on and
spent your
on and
time here.
on, but thank you again. Like I said, and
Yes.
you guys all don't, this is a passion to help educate and advocate.
So great. Okay, so diving in to what is evidence-based practice? Evidence-based practice, hopefully this is familiar to all the SLPs in the audience. This little triangle up on the top of the screen is the evidence-based practice triangle that ASHA has provided us. Basically, it means that there are many different strands of information that we need to take in as clinicians in order to make the best clinical judgment and clinically informed decisions to support our clients in increasing their spontaneous novel utterance generation as SLPs who are supporting folks who use AAC. We've seen the evidence-based triangle also broken out into this evidence-based diamond, which pulls apart the external scientific evidence and more of our internal evidence. And we like that because it does kind of offer a little more depth. So we'll go through these different pieces of evidence and talk about them each in turn. But a reminder that external evidence is one of multiple factors that inform clinical practice. Laboratory evidence alone cannot and should not dominate one's decisions about therapy. In fact, using EBP, the clinician gathers and integrates evidence from a variety of different resources to arrive at a decision, including external evidence, of course, which is along the lines of published studies, published research studies, internal evidence, which we'll go through a little bit on the next slide, but basically refers to evaluation of the client that you are working with at the time. Clinical expertise, our own as clinicians, and also from leaders in related fields, SLPs and other related fields such as special education and occupational therapy, that sort of thing. And then finally, last but not least, client and caregiver perspectives and expertise, as we've heard from some of our panelists tonight. And this includes both the individual family and client, but also the community, the larger community to which they belong. So we have been learning a lot from autistic adults who have shared their stories of how they have become AAC users or how they use and formulate language. So not just, one client and family, but a community of people. So I alluded to this slide earlier. This is kind of the process by which we use and integrate internal evidence. This is from Hill and Romick, and I just really like how they show how many different ingredients there are that we have to bring together in order to make the final dish. We start here and develop a client profile. We want to definitely integrate lived experience from the client, caregiver, and community at this point. We develop and ask meaningful EBP questions, and these questions are then informed by personal evidence and internal experience based on our time with the client. Also, external evidence and published research studies. This is where outside clinical expertise can come in as well. We look at previous performance, we evaluate the evidence, and then we bring in other stakeholders as well before and while we're using the evidence to make therapy decisions. And this is an iterative process as well, right? We don't go through this once and then decide. As those of us who have worked with AAC users throughout the years, change is the only constant. And so we need to continue to think and rethink how we are best supporting our clients. And just a reminder, so this is from the Informed SLP, and it's used in the context of early intervention practices, but I think it applies very well here. When we reduce ideas and practices to binaries, yes or no, black and white, the humans involved can lose out. Humans are very gray, and as Cass told us at the beginning, there are multifaceted things that are coming together to create a lived experience. And we as SLPs can see somebody once a week for an hour, and then they go out and live the rest of their messy, complex, important lives. So kind of stepping through and giving a little bit of examples for each of the different 4 tiers of evidence that we talked about before. So some external evidence that we have for AAC and literacy. The reality is there are no studies that I know of, and if you do know of some, please, we're open, we're here to learn, so please let us know. But there are no studies on long-term outcomes for AAC users. Um, um, it's a newer field, and the technology that a lot of our AAC users are using has not been around for that long. So it's hard to have these long-term outcome studies. There are no or limited studies that bring together multiple discrete evidence-based skill sets to inform holistic AAC intervention. So we know core words are an evidence-based practice for AAC. Aided language stimulation is an evidence-based practice for AAC, but we don't have studies that bring together this and other discrete sets into the perfect dosage and the perfect balance and the perfect way to mix and match these to help support our learners throughout this journey. And for literacy, there are similar limitations in the published evidence on literacy for people with complex communication needs and complex bodies. Following this, external evidence for spelling as a primary mode of communication. Some studies have brought into question and denied the authorship of individuals that use spelling due to the facilitation methods that are interfering with the person's ability to spell, such as using physical touch or using fluid movement of the materials. These studies have relied on the methodology of a message passing test, which is essentially the person supporting the speller is shown an image, the speller is shown an image, they may or may not be the same image, and then the person is asked to spell what they see. Other studies have demonstrated intention and or authorship using different techniques. For instance, accelerometry, eye tracking, as well as natural or spontaneous authorship, which has several different definitions. For example, the person spelling working with a partner who and they are spelling something unexpected that then a person closer to the speller confirms. Or even something like a disagreement between the speller, the person using spelling as communication, and the communication and regulation partner or communication partner, that shows some of the authenticity of that interaction going back and forth. And there have been some lab-based message passing tests that have shown authorship from the people who are spelling as well. So the evidence is one of the external evidence is one of the things that we use to inform our practice. Moving on, some of the internal evidence that we can look for as we are meeting people who are likely going to be AAC users and may use spelling as communication are these characteristics. For instance, we've met people who prefer letters and text compared to symbol-based apps. Stone may be one of those people. The symbol-based app was more for playing, and the text and letters were more adapted to intentional communication. We have some folks who learn to type out websites or search in YouTube. They may look at the text while being read to. They may consume media related to literacy, such as songs, or want the closed captioning on when they're watching movies and things like that. They may use their AAC app with literacy in mind, like going to the keyboard or a search feature to type out a word. They may show that they're playing around with sounds and words. And I just want to point out that this list is in no way exhaustive, and it's also not exclusive. So all robust AAC solutions should and need to include literacy support and instruction, regardless of someone's interest in literacy at baseline. Moving on to the clinical expertise and opinion. This is where we'll really dive into in our next session, is talking about kind of internal evidence in the clinical expertise and opinion, and moving beyond basically examining what we do in evidence-based practice for literacy and AAC instruction, and how we teach. How do we prompt, and how do we facilitate and scaffold? And how do we, using robust AAC, influence the messages that our AAC users are producing intentionally and unintentionally as well? For instance, for cortical visual impairment, we may use a hand under hand, a physical or tactile cue to support a communicator. For a person with cerebral palsy, we may choose to stabilize or physically tactily prompt them to make movements in order to access the communication tool. We may also position or program the AAC tool itself to support individual sensory and motor differences. We may provide some explicit support for motor access to language. For instance, the Lampboards for Life app that has motor programming built in. We may provide, motor cues for speech about tongue, jaw, lip placement. And we may, like I said, Lampboards for Life and other apps have some of that motor support built into them already. We may use partner-assisted scanning or pragmatically organized dynamic displays where the partner, the communication partner, is integral to the formation of the message, right? That it's not something that people are going to be able to use completely independently. We also sometimes use things like visual screen displays, where we're preemptively providing words and topics for someone to use during communication, but by selecting those words and topics, we're influencing what they can and will say. Same thing with any vocabulary organization and selection. That is going to influence how people start their messages, what they start their messages with, how they construct their messages, and all of those different factors. So how can we scrutinize and make sure that we're doing this in a responsible and ethical way, regardless of other strategies that we may be using as well? Finally, moving on to client perspective. So I know we have a lot here, but I do want to slow down and read this. This is a quote from Cal Montgomery, who is an autistic man with intellectual disability and who is a huge advocate, a huge disability advocate. And I just love this quote of his. So Cal Montgomery says, "I'm not saying text-based AAC is better than grid-based. I'm not saying any chunk of a communication system is better than any other kind of chunk. I'm not saying to push for that instead of this. I'm saying that a communication system must be one that takes root in the ground where it will live, and that allows for the fullest expression possible of what the ground already contains. I am saying when you plan in advance how someone else will communicate, you plan what they will communicate, and then it ceases to be communication. When you enforce a particular way of communication and relentlessly prune anything that does not meet your standards, then what should have become perhaps a powerful redwood is trained into a bonsai instead. And a bonsai, however artistically presented, cannot do the work of a tree that has grown as its own nature commanded it. You may have wanted tulips, and by all means, bury a bulb or two and see what comes up in the spring. But if the absence of tulips is all that you can think about, you may miss the sweetness of honeysuckle." I just love that quote. And so again, this primarily talks about AAC and communication as something the client and caregiver perspective that we need to consider, but that's just one of many factors that that clients and caregivers bring to the table through their experience. And we need to not just think about, engaging the client in app selection, or having them sit at the IEP table and collaborate on goals. We need to think about the whole context of their lived experience, and all of the humanness that they bring to the table as well. And so, to tell us a little more about that, I'm going to turn it over to Cass.
Hi, folks. I'm back. So again, if you missed me in the beginning, I'm an autistic parent of autistic kids, who has been in SLP adjacent space for a few years now. It's interesting to be talking about this because, staying curious is how I got here, and kind of needing to go my own path. Our original team said, sorry, your daughter is not a good candidate for robust high-tech AAC because she will not engage at all with low tech, which used to be best practices and is not anymore. Things change. We'll stay curious. So one thing that this journey, my personal journey, has taught me, is that, like, honestly, I don't think professionals have it all figured out, right? That issue that Joe mentioned about there not being long-term studies about AAC users, about my daughter's population, there are a lot of implications to that. Notably, that we can't turn to research exclusively when talking about the experience of living and learning at the intersection of co-occurring disabilities like apraxia and autism, and multiple types of communication and literacy and life skills interventions, right? So we turn to our community, a source of invaluable lived experience. And that's where my lived experience of having met autistic spellers and their families comes in. Frankly, Stone and my daughter swim on the same swim team. We go to the same Y. We are in community with each other, right? And when parents tell me that their child's regulation has dramatically changed since they have started a certain practice, I believe them, right? Because I experienced the same thing with my daughter after she started AAC and after she gained more access to communication, right? Same with the idea of presuming competence, same with the idea that perhaps AAC can support a child in getting like basic requests across, right? But being able to dig in more and get out everything that they want to say, that they need more, right, than what the AAC is providing. I believe them. And yes, like I know the authorship controversies, but honestly, some of it, I'm just gonna, like, speaking frankly, some of it feels very absurd as a parent. Because having read a fair amount of commentary from autistic non-speakers, who are critical of their parents, right? Critical of their parents' choices around therapies, critical of certain things like that. Like, I know mom didn't write that, right? Like, let's just be real, mom did not write that. These young people are in my community and their lives are evidence to me. Which brings me to the thing at the beginning, that this is happening all around me, yet few providers and educators and experts can speak about it knowledgeably. I'll be honest and say that when folks link to just the ASHA statement or perhaps a blog post, the signal to me is that they haven't spent time in community with folks who communicate this way. And honestly, also, it feels like they're content with families who have tried everything for a really long time, right? Not being able to try something that may support them better, right? But at the same time, there's some criticisms there, right? Same time, when I'm in speller space, I swear I've been like so nervous about this entire thing because I feel like no one's gonna like me after it. It feels like no one knows how to support literacy. No one knows at all how to have a conversation about supporting emergent literacy. I can tell you that, you know, my daughter's not hyperlexic, and I've been asked that every time I bring up literacy. And I've also seen firsthand some issues around AAC that concern me, right? Where kids, I think, could benefit from having AAC, but instead, you know, a parent might be sold on a certain method and are just waiting, right, and until the child is literate and they can do that method. And man, that makes me really uncomfortable, right? SLPs need to be in these conversations. And it honestly feels like the twilight zone at times, trying to navigate the disconnects. We need knowledgeable providers willing to learn and willing to problem solve with us in the space between. Communication is the goal. Literacy is required for full communication. And there are a lot of paths for both of those things, and support along those paths already has to be individualized according to the individual person's need, right? Regardless of method. We scaffold learning, we fade supports, we accept that about traditional AAC. One thing I want to mention is that with our toddler AAC journey, starting at age 2, everyone understands sort of implicitly that where we are is not the end game, right? That's not the end goal. It's understood that we are on a collaborative learning journey together, and that she will grow in independence. Independent typing of self-generated messages is the ultimate goal, but you don't just jump right to that from the start. And dismissing entirely because someone is not independent enough from the start, to me, honestly feels like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Making this a taboo topic serves no one, least of all our loved ones. So I think that's where I will stop. And I want to pass it to Artie to talk about her experience as far as the journey through other therapies and her family's experience.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Arti Bhatia, and I am mom of Sam, who is a 20-year-old college student. We started our spelling journey when he was about 17. So we did the usual. There are Sam's providers right on this call who have exposed him to Nova Chat in the early years, and you know, those were very restricted to just manding and requesting things. But he was never really a functionally full communicator until we just showed him the 26 letters, and you know, he started communicating. So Sam is a semi-independent typer, depending on how he's regulated at that particular moment. He can be completely independent, or he may need some co-regulation that I'm the one that mostly provides for him. Sam is in college. He is in North Seattle College with regular students and doing college classes. This would not have been possible if we had not gone down this path. And there are things, just like Cass said, there are things that he tells me about what I did wrong for the first 17 years that I would not have told myself, because I spent a lot of money and time doing some therapies that he completely disagrees with right now, which has caused a lot of trauma for him and me. Because as a mom, I feel so sad that, you know, I actually put him through all those therapies. So if I'm the one communicating, I would not be doing that, right? So we have all those discussions every day. We go back and forth, and I make it a point to apologize to him every single day about all the things that I put him through personally, because I just didn't know. Now that I know better, why? Because he's the one that's telling me. He's the one that is kind of directing me every day. And as a 20-year-old, that's what he should be doing. So I'm glad to be here. We'll be there in November. You'll all get to meet Sam, and he'll be there telling his own story. Joe.
Okay, that's me, actually. I'm going to take a moment to regroup because, as we thought might happen, we have some folks in the chat who are sharing their thoughts and ideas in a way that feels a little bit like the great political divide that we're experiencing at this time and place. And what we were hoping for, if we can have some time, is that those folks who have ideas that they want to share can raise their hand during the discussion time and turn on their camera so we can see who they are and share the ideas that they would like to share. By um, hiding behind the chat, we're hoping, well, I guess I would say I'm hoping that you'll continue to stay with us, that we're going to try to present some evidence going into the sensory and motor differences rather than only focusing on cognition and behavior, specifically for autism individuals. And then that'll take about 10 minutes. And then with the last 10 minutes, we will have some time. We're going to do a very brief history of facilitated communication, spelling to communicate, and those strategies which have been found to be not validated. And so we're hoping you'll stay with us and you'll listen to the rest of the discussion. And then if we have time, we'll open it up for your comments. And if not, we hope to see you next month. So what is the evidence for continuing sensory and motor differences rather than only focusing on cognition and behavior? Go ahead, Joe. Historically, the view is that most individuals with autism have no significant motor impairment, but do have severe intellectual disabilities. And this assumption has affected the type of AAC interventions offered, mostly narrowly focused on functional communication skills such as requesting. However, research has provided evidence challenging this assumption, and we want to investigate new ways to support people with autism to communicate. We want to consider intervention approaches that target motor, language, and literacy practices. Go ahead, Joe. A note about the ADOS. Historically, autism spectrum disorders was seen as primarily a disorder of communication, and there was a measurement that's still used quite widely called the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. It is a standardized way to diagnose autism. It involves scoring direct observations of the child's interactions, and it accounts for their developmental level and age. It's designed to elicit social interactions, communication, and to observe or note repetitive behaviors, though there is no specific assessment of motor skills on this measure. Go ahead. Let's talk about the tests that we have. Joe kind of alluded to this already. We have tests for language, cognition, and literacy, and these are all dependent on motor output in one way or another. But we haven't really considered the motor skills that are necessary to participate in these tests for autistic individuals. For cerebral palsy, we assume that there is a motor barrier, and we try to provide alternative ways to teach and express communication. But for autism, there's always been this assumption that it's a cognitive piece when really it could be a motor barrier. We really haven't truly presented alternative modalities for learning or expressing literacy in the same way we have for other motor-based disabilities. And so what we want to share with you is that we believe autistics do have motor challenges that make it more difficult to access communication, reading, and spelling. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be so brief on this one. I've got 4 bullet points, and the first 2 really just speak to the evidence, the external evidence that's out there. Fournier and colleagues, 2010, did a synthesis and meta-analysis of studies for motor coordination and autism and found, yep, indeed, they are a defining feature of ASD. And then Zampella and colleagues in 2021 stated their motor challenges in ASD are pervasive, clinically relevant, and under-recognized, with up to 87% of the autistic population affected, but only a small percentage receiving motor-focused clinical care. And so the first two are just a short example of that we need to be looking at motor. The third bullet point has to do with sensory motor. And if I had another hour, I might not even be able to do this article justice. It was very heady for me. But basically, these authors, Brickner and Torres in 2017, looked at motor movement connected to underlying physiological states. They wondered why the definition of autism completely ignores movement and sensation. And they questioned how movement might be viewed as the individual attempts to cope with underlying physiological issues. And so what they did is they measured the noise in the muscles of folks who have autism. And they found that the muscle fibers and the firing of those muscles was less organized, less refined, and more like that of a younger child. And so what they ask for is a reconceptualization of movement, sensation, and control. Now, let me explain my interpretation of this, which is, and I'm not an OT or PT. If there are any in the audience, we can chat later. I would love to get more insight. But my takeaway is that the typical way of measuring gait, for example, is to come to a clinic and to walk and to watch the gait. And then if you say, well, the child walks, check, they're within normal limits. And what these authors are saying is it's so much more complicated than that, is that the movement is related to sensation and is also related to the underlying physiological state. So you can't just measure walking for the sake of walking. You have to imagine, let's say you're in a train station and you are walking through and you're calm and you're regulated. But what would happen if it was really busy, or you're running late for your train, or the ceiling is really high and echoey and there's lots of people walking, clicking on the floor? You might feel that underlying physiological state, which is going to influence your sensation and going to influence your movement. So to me, this particular study was mind blowing, and so I'm sharing that with you. The references are below, and then the final one Joe already alluded to, so we're going to skip that for a minute. Go ahead, Joe. From a client, patient, caregiver perspectives, the evidence that we hear from the clients themselves is true testament. David Teplitz says, my treasonous body. Who has ever said treasonous and body in the same sentence, right? How beautifully stated and how heartbreaking. My treasonous body makes it difficult to spend the entire day at school. Hari Srinivasan, so many quotes. Communication is worth the motor effort required by an uncooperative and impulsive body. My body can feel like driving a car with a loose steering wheel. You may attempt to turn the wheel, but are not sure if the car will go where you want it to go. Elizabeth Bunker, now I communicate by typing on a keyboard, but when I first started, I spelled out words by pointing to letters on a letterboard. People with non-speaking autism often have difficulty initiating movements, so learning to type is tedious. With months of practice, I made progress and the world began to open up for me. And so that initiating movements speaks to what David and Stone were reflecting on as well. Go ahead. So I'm looking at my watch. I know we're running short on time, but we're just going to take a moment and we're going to breathe because there's a lot of ideas floating around. We're going to pause and reflect. What does this paradigm shift mean for you in your practice? How might you look at your child, client, or student? and consider what is the state that's prompting the sensation or movement that manifests as behavior. And then I can't help but, be a little bit snarky. Like, what would happen if we just stopped using the word behavior, right? And instead considered words like regulation and engagement and connection. Go ahead, Joe. So with that breath, we're going to dive into the last part of our evidence, and that is, what is the history of learning to spell for communication? Go ahead. We are going to look at specific programs that are under scrutiny: facilitated communication, rapid prompting method, spelling to communicate, and speller's method. And then in November, we will look at other literacy programs and strategies for non-speaking individuals. So I'll give you a little bit of background on why this was really important to me to share. I got out of grad school in the 90s, thanks, revealing my age, and was in the thick of it during the facilitated communication movement. So I remember it well from my early clinical days. Um, I think it's really important to look at the progression of what has happened since since the 90s, essentially up until present day, because I think we can all learn. History is a way of learning what went well, what didn't work well, in a way to inform where we go next. And so I was speaking with, so for families, if you are diving into this topic, the history helps you see the bigger picture of what's been tried, what's not worked, and so forth. But mostly this came to me because I was talking with a young SLP who had no idea, had kind of vaguely heard about FC in a grad class, and then just was told never to talk about it again. And I do think it's important that we know the history of what has been presented, and then what has been the response to it. So facilitated communication, also known as supported typing, dates back to the 70s, came out of Australia and Denmark by a person named Rosemary Crosley. She was working initially with folks with cerebral palsy, so she was right there in the thick of the motor part of her practice. And she noted that with physical assistance, she could internally rotate the client's arm and raise it from its retracted position, and that individual could use her hand to point to items and pictures. So in their clinic, they noted that the majority of their clients didn't have cerebral palsy, but actually had neuromotor challenges that affected their access to communication. So back in the 70s, they're seeing things like challenges with eye-hand coordination, impulsiveness, perseveration, low muscle tone, and the inability to isolate an index finger. Go ahead. In FC, it requires a partner who provides a bare minimum of support, light touch when supporting the partner's hand, and the use of backward pressure instead of forward pressure, and supports the individually emotionally and physically by examining their posture and their eye contact. This technique came to the United States specifically through Syracuse University, which is my undergraduate alma mater, through Doug Bicklin, who I never had the pleasure of meeting. There were some controversial situations where the authoring of the message came into question, with allegations of abuse. And this caused so much trauma for the children and their families, and for the partners as well. Because of this significant trauma and these allegations, there were some studies led by Howard Shane out of Boston Children's Hospital that revealed that the partners, not the non-speaking persons, were forming the messages. In other words, the partners were authoring the messages, not the non-speaking persons. This led ASHA, American Speech Language Hearing Association, and several other organizations to make statements against the use of FC. Go ahead. So starting in about 2001, rapid prompting method came along. This is where partners deliver instruction at a rate that competes with stereotypy and encourages attention to task. The partner states information, then asks a question, and then the student responds. This loop is intended to create an alertness and improve focus in the student. There's a use of a letterboard and eventually handwriting paired with sensory prompts dependent to the student. And these prompts encourage the student to respond to questions and engage in learning opportunities. The partner learns how to access these open learning channels, whatever their learning channels are, auditory, visual, tactile, kinesthetic, of the student, and then adapts the lessons in ways that help. There is no hands-on the person, but in this method, the partner is holding a letterboard. And for this reason, RPM was considered an unacceptable instructional tool by ASHA. Go ahead. So let's see, we've got the 90s, we've got 2001, starting in about 2015, Spelling to Communicate came about. It was created by Elizabeth Vossler, teaching the individual to point to letters on a board as an alternative means of communication. And the primary ideas behind their approach was to promote synchrony between the cognitive and the motor systems. They thought that through repeated practice, new neural pathways would become myelinated. And as the client grows and learns, this leads to adaptations in instruction. This improves the motor planning and control and thus supports the ability to communicate ideas quickly and accurately. There is no hands-on the person. The partner is holding a letterboard. And for this reason, S2C is also considered an unacceptable instructional tool by ASHA. Go ahead. Finally, we're going to cover Speller's method. This was created in 2017 by Dawn Marie Gavin and Dana Johnson. They looked at a holistic approach to helping non-speakers engage in open-ended questions. And the holistic approach components were including communication partner coaching, working on intentional movement, and vision and ocular motor training. So the method focuses on building two skills, the motor-based skills required to point to letters, and then what they call foundational skills to increase autonomy in both communication and life. And I think all of this information and all of these methods come straight off of these folks' websites. I think what they're saying here is that the method that has been created using a multidisciplinary approach, such as including occupational therapists, developmental optometry, and assistive technology to consider and provide accommodations no matter what their sensory motor profile. There is no hands-on the person. Go ahead to the next slide. I'm not sure what it is. Yeah, perfect. Okay. And so that's a lot of information in a very short period of time. We went through the motor information, and then we went through the history of the methods that have been tried in the past. And I'm hoping your takeaway will be to think about, well, what can that history teach us? What worked? What didn't work with one that somebody else tried to reinvent it, and then somebody else tried to reinvent it and make it better, make some changes? What can we learn from what works and what doesn't work in this 30-year history of folks trying to support spelling for communication? ASHA says these are all problematic, and they are not evidence-based practices according to ASHA. Yet I come back to this slide because it does seem undeniable that there are hundreds of folks out there who are using spelling, independently using spelling for generative language. And I'm just so curious to continue to learn from those folks in order to support our clients moving forward.